Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my hands-on first looks review of the Fujifilm X-S10, a mid-range mirrorless camera with a 26 megapixel APS-C sensor, uncropped 4K video, a fully articulated touchscreen and built-in stabilization. Announced in October 2020, the X-S10 debuts a new branch in the X system with a departure from the company's retro-styled exposure controls for a more modern PASM mode selection that's used by most of the competition, along with the entry-level X series models. But don't be fooled into thinking the X-S10 is in any way basic, as it shares the core features of the X-T30 while adding a bigger grip, side-hinged screen, longer 4K recording times, and impressively becoming Fujifilm's smallest and most affordable camera to squeeze in built-in image stabilization, or IBIS for short. In fact, in many respects, the X-S10 is close to a baby X-T4, packing much of the flagship into a smaller, lighter, and more approachable body that at $999 or £949 is roughly two-thirds the price of that model and only around $100 more expensive than the X-T30. Fujifilm let me try out a pre-production model for a few days, and in this video I'll show you why the X-S10 could be the X camera you've been waiting for. As always, once I've fully tested a final production model, I'll link to my in-depth review right here. Here's the new X-S10 on the left, joined on the right by the older X-T30, which is arguably the closest looking model in the series. The X-S10 is a little taller and wider than the X-T30, although their main body thickness is actually very similar. The most obvious difference, though, is the considerably more substantial grip of the X-S10, allowing the battery to relocate and free up some space inside for the IBIS system, while also giving you much more to hold on to. Viewed from the top, the different profiles and grips become more obvious, as do their different approaches to controls. The X-T30 employs the dedicated shutter speed dial of most higher-end Fujifilm bodies, as well as dials dedicated for exposure compensation and drive modes. Also note the small shutter release button threaded for a mechanical cable release, and also the flash pins on the hot shoe, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The overall aesthetic of the classic Fujifilm style is all about direct control and retro style, but while some love the wealth of numbers on the dials, they can prove less approachable to others, even intimidating to some. So the new X-S10 has opted for the mode-based approach of most rival models, and also some simpler models in the Fujifilm range, with a mode dial joined by a finger and thumb dial on the right hand side and a customizable dial on the left. Notice the larger shutter release button, now positioned further forward on the grip, which falls more comfortably under your finger than the X-T30, although I personally found the sloping power collar lacked a bit of purchase and was a little bit harder to turn. The movie record, ISO and quick menu buttons on the top surface all work as labelled by default, but along with the function, AE lock and AF on buttons to the right of the viewfinder can all be customised to operate any of 60 different settings spread across 8 pages. That's a lot of customisation. The upper left control dial can also be customised, and while traditionalists may assign it to something like exposure compensation, I enjoyed the default setting where it scrolls through the film simulations, which apply Fujifilm's famous colour and tone styles. In fact, it's worth taking a quick break from the design to check out the new user interface for the film simulations, which is not only more colourful to start with, but also offers optional information pages describing each profile and how you might use it. I'm very fond of Fujifilm's film simulations and how they let me achieve most of the effects I'm after all in camera. I'm particularly fond of Velvia for highly saturated subjects, classic chrome or classic negative for a moody retro style, or Acros for high contrast black and white. You'll find the full set here, including the latest Eterna bleach bypass for those zombie apocalypse shots, along with the monochrome adjustments, grain and colour chrome effects. It's also worth mentioning the full auto exposure mode can now access a new auto film simulation option that can choose between a handful of profiles, as well as deploying colour chrome effects if it sees fit. Also remember, if you shoot in RAW, you can create new versions of your photos in playback with different film simulations. I love doing this to try out different profiles on the same image. I mentioned the flash pins earlier, and notice how the X-S10, or at least my pre-production sample, has 5 small pins compared to 3 on the X-T30. You'll generally find these on higher-end Fujifilm bodies to support unpowered flash accessories. I'm not sure why this was included here though, since the X-S10, like the X-T30, includes a small pop-up flash triggered by a color switch on the custom control dial. While loyal Fuji fans will miss the retro aesthetic, there's no denying it's very easy to get started with the X-S10, and even though I personally prefer the look of the X-T30 and X-T4, I have to admit I generally set the shutter dials on those models to A or T, effectively turning them into mode-based models. Between the three control dials, wealth of customizable buttons, AF joystick and practical touchscreen, it's possible to set up the X-S10 exactly how you want it, and I love that you can still keep doubling the shutter speed beyond the usual arbitrary limit of 30 seconds to as long as 15 minutes before having to resort to bulb. Fujifilm's also learned from the poorly positioned Q menu button on the X-T30, which proved a bit too easy to touch by mistake, and has relocated it sensibly to the top surface. Indeed, beyond the reduced purchase of the shutter collar, and that's just my own personal feeling, my only real physical complaint is that, like the X-T30, the X-S10 is not officially weather sealed, a downside compared to the Sony a6400 and a6600, at least in theory. That said, I've never experienced any issue shooting with the X-T30 in a wide variety of conditions. In a move that will delight anyone who needs to film or photograph themselves, the X-S10 employs a side-hinged, fully articulated screen. In fact, it's only the second Fujifilm to do it after the X-T4. Fujifilm has explored more screen articulation options than most companies, and while everyone has their preferred style, mine remains a side hinge, not just for filming, but also composing comfortably at high or low angles in the landscape or tall portrait orientations. And remember, Fujifilm considerately rotates the shooting info in portrait mode too, at least when you're shooting stills. The X-S10 inherits the 2.36 million dot OLED viewfinder of the X-T30 with its 0.62 times magnification. The resolution is comparable to rivals at its price, but the magnification is a bit smaller. The viewfinder on the Sony a6400, for instance, delivers a bigger image with 0.7 times magnification, and this is also a differentiator with the higher-end X-T4, whose viewfinder is larger still at 0.75 times, and more detailed too with 3.69 million dots. If you're comparing the X-S10 to Canon's M6 II though, remember that the Canon model does not include a viewfinder as standard. That is an accessory that will cost you a little bit more. Behind a flap on the left hand side you'll find USB-C and micro HDMI ports, while a standard 3.5mm microphone input is positioned higher to clear the screen. And yes, finally a departure from those annoying 2.5mm jacks of many earlier Fujifilm models. Like the X-T30, but unlike most rivals at this price point, the HDMI port can output 10-bit 422 to an external recorder, while the USB-C port supports both in-camera charging and power over USB, so you could use a power bank battery to keep the camera running. Like some earlier Fujifilm cameras, you can also use the USB-C port as a headphone jack, and Fujifilm considerately includes a compatible adapter in the box. And finally, the X-S10 also becomes the first mid-ranger in the series so far to work as a webcam over USB. The X-S10 is powered by the same small battery as the X-T30, good here for a claimed 400 shots. For video, I managed an hour's worth of 4K on a single charge. That's the same as I did on the X-T30, although on the X-S10 it's just split into 2 half-hour clips instead of 6 10-minute clips. The bigger news though is the battery's relocation into the grip, along with a tripod thread that's closer to the optical axis than the X-T30, and this means you'll be able to more easily access the battery compartment and card slot without removing most tripod plates. Like the X-T30, the single SD card slot is housed alongside the battery, and it remains unable to exploit the speed of UHS 2 cards. If you want faster or dual slots, it's the single digit XT or X Pro series for you, although to be fair, neither Canon's M6 II or the Sony a6600 has dual slots either. As a member of the X series, the X-S10 can of course use any X-mount lens with 35 to choose from at the time of writing. Fujifilm has embraced the APS-C format for mirrorless more than Sony or Canon, and it shows in the native lens selection. Meanwhile, the X-Trans 4 sensor may now be 2 years old, having made its debut on the X-T3, but remains Fujifilm's best sensor to date, and coupled here with the X Processor 4, so you're getting the same photo quality as the X-T4 and X Pro 3. Best quality images measure 6240 by 4160 pixels and can be recorded as JPEGs, RAW files, or both together. There's 2 JPEG levels of compression and the choice of RAW compression too if you like. The X-Trans 4 sensor sports embedded phase detector autofocus across the entire frame, and the X-S10 can fire bursts at up to 8 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, or up to 20 frames per second with the silent electronic shutter without any cropping. If you're happy with a small crop though, the electronic bursts are available up to 30 frames per second, although in all of the electronic modes beware of skewing due to rolling shutter. Here's a burst taken with the fastest mechanical shutter of 8 frames per second. Canon's M6 II can shoot almost twice as fast with its mechanical shutter, but 8 frames per second is fast enough for most, and remember there's still those quicker electronic modes if you like. Here's another burst, this time taken with the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second, but also using the optional pre-burst mode. I actually pushed the shutter down as soon as the block hit the water, but pre-burst buffered a few frames beforehand to ensure I grabbed the moment. So far so similar to the other models in the range, so let's get on with that big new feature, Fujifilm's third IBIS unit in the X series and its most compact yet. It's a 5-axis system that claims up to 6 stops of compensation depending on the lens. That's half a stop less than the best case scenario claimed by the X-T4, but half a stop better than the best case on the X-H1. Here's the view from the X-S10 when fitted with the unstabilised XF35mm f2 lens and with IBIS disabled. It's pretty wobbly, right? After enabling IBIS in the menus and returning to the live view, the image has become much steadier. For me, IBIS is as useful for composing carefully with unstabilised lenses as it is for hand-holding slower shutters. It really makes lenses like the XF56, 90 and 16-55 so much more usable. Now here's a couple of photos I took with the X-S10, although as a pre-production model I can't comment further on quality. That said, with the same sensor and processor as the most recent generation of higher-end Fujifilm bodies, the image quality is already very well known. Just look at my X-T3, X-T4, X-T30 and X-Pro 3 reviews for a load of examples, and as always, all of my original images are available to download from cameralabs.com. Moving on to video, the X-S10 unsurprisingly inherits the core movie capabilities of the X-T30, so you're getting uncropped 4K from 24 to 30p or 1080 up to 60p in either the UHD or DCI shapes, and you also get separate exposure controls for stills and video, the option of internal F-Log for grading, as well as 10-bit 422 output over HDMI. The X-S10 does, however, now allow you to record much more useful half-hour clips in 4K, unlike the 10-minute clip for 4K on the X-T30, and I managed to record 2 on a single battery charge without any overheating. Plus, the microphone input and screen articulation are now better suited for videographers. The big news for video though, of course, remains IBIS, so here's a clip I filmed with the unstabilised XF35mm f2, first with IBIS disabled where the footage is, well, pretty much unusable. Next, here's the X-S10 with IBIS enabled, which will also work alongside OIS on lenses that have it. This one doesn't though. You can't choose one technology over the other though, but as an unstabilised lens, you're seeing the pure benefit of IBIS alone here. Now here's IBIS with optional digital image stabilisation, which depending on your subject and motion can help further steadying. Notice the 1.1 times crop, that slightly reduces the field of view. And now for IBIS with digital image stabilisation and the additional IS boost enabled. This is designed to provide better stabilisation for static subjects. Note that all these tests were performed with a pre-production model. Here's another example with a more distant outdoor scene on a windy day, so expect some buffeting. Here again starting with the XF35mm f2 lens and with IBIS disabled on this clip. And now with IBIS enabled, where there's still some wobbling from the wind, but it's still a big improvement. Next, we've got IBIS with digital image stabilisation, where again there's that 1.1 times crop. And finally, IBIS with digital image stabilisation and IS boost. Oh, and for good measure, here's the X-S10 with the XF18-55mm kit lens with IBIS and optical image stabilisation enabled, just to illustrate how these two technologies can work together. If you're into slow motion, the X-S10 can film 1080 up to 240p, and here's a clip I filmed in 200p for an 8x slowdown on my 25p timeline. Which means it's now time for a quick vlog test with some news of an updated 10-24mm lens before my initial verdict of the camera. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is a quick vlogging test with the Fujifilm X-S10. Now, before I go any further, it's important to state that this is a pre-production sample, so the performance and quality that you see may not be reflective of final models, but since it's one of Fujifilm's most compelling cameras for vlogging, I thought it'd be a bit remiss of me not to at least give it a shot, right? So here we go. I'm filming this in 1080 at 25p, nice motion-friendly shutter speed of a 50th of a second, and I'm using the XF 18-55mm kit zoom, well, one of the kit zoom options, at 18mm f2.8. Okay, I've switched to 4K at 25p. 4K on the X-S10 is available between 24 and 30p, so it misses out on the 50 and 60p 4K of the X-T4 and also the 10-bit internal recording, plus a couple of other things. But it's actually more notable what it shares with the X-T4. And of course, as you already know, it becomes Fujifilm's smallest, lightest and most affordable camera, with those key vlogging benefits, including a fully articulated side hinge screen, which means I can see myself right now. Although I do also have a tally light illuminated on the front to tell me that I'm recording. Very handy. It also has the built-in image stabilization, as you know, and things like microphone input, and of course the same sensor as the X-T4, which means you get the same image quality and those same film simulations as well. Fujifilm could have removed a bunch of them, but we've got the full set, including Eterna, which is what I'm filming in now, for really nice out of camera quality, and also the bleach bypass option if you want to film a zombie apocalypse. Well, stick around much longer and that's what we might be facing. Okay, I've now switched to the XF10 to 24mm. This is an f4 lens, so I have reduced the aperture by 1 stop from f2.8 to f4. And I've got it currently filming at 24mm, so that's even tighter than before, but of course the benefit of this lens is being able to do this. I'm now filming at 10mm f4 again. Still, it's a constant aperture zoom. Now, before I go any further, the XS10 announcement was also joined by the welcome news of an update to the XF10 to 24. So I'm pleased to say that a new version of this lens should become available during 2021 with weather resistance, although I believe that the optical construction is otherwise identical. But for now, let's see how the combination of OIS and IBIS are looking. In fact, this is what you've been watching the whole time, but there's another setting I'm going to change to. Okay, now I have enabled digital movie image stabilization. This is in addition to sensor shift and optical stabilization, all three working at the same time. Now I'm just going to pause for a moment because these technologies don't always play well when you're actually walking around. So let's just see how it looks with a more static subject. I found in my tests with previous Fujifilm bodies that their stabilization works best when you're trying to frame a static composition as still as possible. The weather's turned, it's definitely very autumnal now, and as a consequence my sensitivity has been up at well over 400, 800 ISO. At the moment at f4 I'm filming at about 1000 ISO, so if you watch any of my other videos that's something to bear in mind. Right, I think that's all of the vlogging that I want to do. So do check back on my final review to see what the performance of this is like on a final production sample, which means right now, let's wrap up this video with my initial verdict.
The Fujifilm X-S10 represents a new branch in the X series, delivering the power and quality of the X-T series, but with a more approachable control system. So it's out with a retro-styled shutter dial and in with a more common PASM mode dial control, which, while lacking vintage charm, may prove easier for first-time Fujifilm owners. Now, whatever your control preference, the X-S10's grip makes it way easier to hold than the X-T30 and much more practical with a wider range of lenses, while a side-hinged, fully articulated screen provides greater compositional flexibility. Most importantly, the X-S10 becomes the most compact model in the series to support built-in stabilization. And while Fujifilm reckons the X-T4's IBIS remains a little better with some lenses, I found the X-S10's IBIS still transformed the use of unstabilized lenses for both photos and video. Videographers will also appreciate the standard microphone input, half-hour 4K clips, and the chance to adapt the USB-C port for headphones. Now, while I personally prefer the look of the X-T30, I actually found the X-S10 to be a much more practical and flexible camera to use, and I'd ultimately choose it over that model, especially for only $100 more. The lack of official weather sealing is the only real downside, but I've never experienced issues with the equally unsealed X-T30. Overall, the X-S10 is a very strong camera for the money and becomes arguably more compelling than either the Canon M6 II and Sony a6600, and it proves that there's plenty of life left in the APS-C format. Now that's all I can say until I test a final production model, although you can of course check out my in-depth X-T30 and X-T4 reviews to see how the image and video quality should stack up. After all, it shares the same sensor and image processor. So all that's left now is to politely request a like and a follow if you found this video useful, along with a comment letting me know what you think of the X-S10. Once again, look out for my final review, which I'll link to here when it's ready. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.